Yes, of course.
Yes.
Good evening. I'm very grateful to see you all. Partially I'm seeing you, partially there are people joining us via Teams. On the behalf of the National Library of Latvia, I'm very grateful to greet you today. A very special evening on the eve before the opening of the guest exhibition of the National Library of Latvia. The name of the exhibition is The Essence of a Typographer, Niclaes Mollijns, Riga, Antwerp. But before we start our today's conversation, I have one practical question to those people who are joining us via internet. Is the sound okay? Is the sound is working? Can you hear us well? Before I introduce today's speakers, once again, I would like to draw your attention to the context of the exhibition. The story of Niclaes Mollijns begins here in Antwerp, in the city where he was born. He was an apprentice of Christopher Plantin, and later on he went to modern territory of Latvia, in Riga, where he became the first printer, not only the first printer in Riga, but in the whole region of Livonia. That's why this exhibition is a great opportunity to dive into the essence of the printer, to explore the peculiarities of his printing work. And we would like to say a great thank you to the Antwerp Society of Bibliophiles for providing an access to the article that both of us, those who are present here in the auditorium and those who are listening via Teams, can download by following the link. The exhibition is opening tomorrow, but today we have the great opportunity to participate in a workshop organized by the content author of the exhibition and my colleague from the National Library of Latvia, the collections expert Beāte Orlova. But before giving the floor to Beāte, I would like to introduce another speaker, Zanna van Loon, who is a curator of rare books and manuscripts at Museum Plantin-Moretus, to introduce the life story of Niclaes Mollijns and share some interesting details. So Zanna, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, welcome everybody. So before we head into Niclaes Mollijns and what he did in Riga, I wanted to show you why he is an important figure for the Museum Plantin-Moretus. He's not following me. Oh, I'm sorry, the camera is following Ineta. He does not respond. Okay. 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 So Niclaes Mollijns was born in Antwerp as the son of Jan I Mollijns. He was born in a printing family. His father was not only a printer, but he was also a woodcutter. And Niclaes decided to join the trade like his father, and he started out as an apprentice in the printing office of Christoph Plantin. He was an apprentice between the years of 1573 and 1575, and in that year he also became a member of the St. Lucas Guilds, starting as an independent printer. We only know him from his imprints. He was not acting as a bookseller because he mostly printed for other Antwerp publishers. So he was what we would call a jobbing printer. But we have some actual archival information that proves that he was working in our printing office. If you can please switch the screens. First of all, we have an archival document that lists the payments that Plantin made to his workmen. And among these, is it visible? Okay. Amongst these, we can see his name here. It says Niclaes Mollijns. So he was one of the workmen in the printing office of Christoph Plantin who also got paid for his job. If we then turn to the page where we can read more about his payments, the two facing pages, and we see all the dates that he was working in the office together with the payments he was made. You also see that normally you would see what he was doing in the office. So we can see he was a printer, imprimeur in French, I'm sorry. And normally you would see the quires of the books he was printing. But in this case, you can only see other names. And this means he was an assistant printer for another printer. In this case, for instance, Reinier or Hans van Leuven. And if we look at one particular payment, the one of the 22nd of August, he was working together with Hans, it says. Now, if we take a look at the payments for Hans van Leuven, we see that on the 22nd of August, he was printing the quires A to K of an emblem book, but also he started printing the breviary in octavo format, the quires A to C. We still have a copy of that book in our collection. Kunt je even openen voor mij? Yeah. Which allows us to see the actual quires that Niclaes Mollijns helped to print as an inkbeater. So we know that Niclaes Mollijns had this particular paper in his hands. But this was all before he moved to Riga to establish his own printing business, of which Beāte will tell you all about in her talk. So I will give you the floor.
One, two. Is it? Okay, good. Okay, so already since the late 1700s, historians in the Baltic region who were interested in the printing history in Riga believed that Niclaes Mollijns, the first printer of the city of Riga, must have originally come from the German lands. For centuries, Riga had been in the political and the cultural sphere of influence of Germany. Therefore, it must have seemed logical for these scholars to believe that he must have also come from Germany to work in Riga. It was only in the 1920s when the Dutch scholar Combertus Peter Berger came forth with the thesis that the Niclaes Mollijns who set up shop in Riga in 1588 was also the same printer who disappeared from local Dutch records around 1586. While this claim has never been seriously disputed, it has never been seriously explored either.
The two periods of Mollijns' life and work, the ones in Antwerp and Riga, have remained mostly separate. Scholars in Belgium and the Netherlands working on his time in Antwerp, and the Latvian scholars working on his time in Riga, hardly ever making any connections between these two periods of his life. The purpose of the exhibition, which is already mentioned, and subsequently the purpose of this talk, is to take the first steps in finally bringing together the two periods of Niclaes Mollijns' life, and looking at it as a whole continuous body of work instead of two separate spheres that seemingly had very little in common. Next slide, please. And C.P. Berger had based his idea of the Antwerp and Riga printers being the same person on the fact that they had a similar name. Here it must be noted that in Riga, Mollijns used the Latinized version of his name, so he might not have been instantly recognizable. Moreover, a detailed comparison of the books printed both in Antwerp and Riga has never really been done in very great detail. Therefore, this theory can be proved also in this way. And so, since the written records on the life of Mollijns is quite sparse, the question I had in preparing this exhibition was, can the printed matter, the actual printed physical books from his press, tell us anything about the person behind these works? Essentially, could the typographical evidence also serve as biographical information in any way? What information could the woodcuts, the ornaments, and types Mollijns used, and where he sourced them, reveal to us about his biography, his whereabouts, the operations of his printing office, and other historical contents? Of course, Mollijns would have also had other people working for him during the time that he worked as an independent printer, but in this case, we'll be talking about him as a master printer overseeing the overall processes of his printing office. I will also note that I will be focusing on the type ornaments and vignettes that he used, leaving a discussion on type and any other elements for a later time. But before we get into answering these questions, some brief contextual information would be necessary. So the next slide, please. Okay, so Niclaes Mollijns was born around 1550 in Antwerp, as Anna already mentioned, to a family already connected to the book trade. His father, Jan Mollijns I, was an established woodcutter and printer, active in Antwerp since the 1530s. His brother, Jan Mollijns II, would also receive a printer's certificate, but would primarily go on to work in bookselling. Jan Mollijns I did have some issues with the authorities during his time in Antwerp, and for some time of 6 years he was even banished from the city for printing Protestant texts. Faith seemed to have been a very important part of Niclaes's life as well. He would also print Protestant texts in a particularly Catholic society. And as it turns out, by analyzing his work, family ties and the experience of his father also seems to play a large part in his work later on in life. Then, during the years 1573 to 1575, as we have already seen, he works as an apprentice printer for Christophe Plantin. So it can really be said that he learned his craft as a printer by observing the daily operations of one of the best of the most successful printing offices of his time. In the year he stopped working for Plantin, he is also accepted in the St. Lucas Guild as the son of a master printer, so his abilities are then also recognized by a larger organization. A year later, he inherits the printing office of his father, who has passed away in the meantime. Thus, he begins his own work as a printer. In Antwerp, his works are most often printed anonymously. The reasons for this are twofold. First, he often fulfilled commissions for other printer publishers, so these are the names that would show up on the title pages instead of his own. Second, as I mentioned, he seems to be a very devout Protestant in a region that is mainly governed by Catholic rulers at the time. And like his father, he would also often print controversial religious sermons or pamphlets, and these would then be anonymous to avoid detection by the authorities. So in many cases, his works from the Antwerp period can be attributed to him only by the analysis of typographical evidence. And in Riga, where he was the only printer and therefore very well known in the local society, of course, the situation is then completely reversed. In 1586, the last known book that we are at least aware of is printed by Mollijns in Antwerp, after which he disappears from any further local records. But then, since he only shows up in Riga around 2 years later, in 1588, this raises the question of where he was in the meantime. So it's not entirely certain. Some scholars have guessed at a temporary move to Dordrecht, where many of the Protestant inhabitants of Antwerp fled to after the fall of Antwerp to the Catholic Spanish forces. In the 1920s, some scholars have also suggested Amsterdam as a potential destination, but this is still somewhat unclear. What we do know is that in 1588, Niclaes Mollijns prints his first book in Riga. Riga is at this time the capital of the region of Livonia, which, as you can see, encompasses modern-day Latvia and Estonia. He became the city printer, meaning he primarily printed commissions for the Riga City Council. He printed public ordinances, various texts for the educational and religious institutions of the city, speeches or other occasional works of prominent city citizens, and similar texts. And of course, the city council would often have a say in what type of material was to be printed and in what way. Livonia, while also experiencing some struggles between Catholics and Lutherans, was, after all, a firmly Protestant region. Therefore, it could have offered Mollijns the religious freedom he felt perhaps that he lacked previously. He received various privileges from the city council and the sovereigns over Livonia, remaining the only printer in Riga throughout the rest of his life. This, however, caused some discontent among other craftsmen in the city who often petitioned the city council to allow them to establish other print shops in the city, but during Mollijns' lifetime, this never happened. In 1625, Niclaes Mollijns passes away, and his printing office did not pass on to his heirs, as he seems to have wished, but to one of the craftsmen who, as I mentioned, had been petitioning the city council for years to establish his own printing office, but a bit more on his successors later. So, next slide. So to try and answer these questions which were set out previously, the first task was to identify particular woodcuts and type ornaments that Mollijns used both in Antwerp and Riga, trying to see what was it that he brought over when he first arrived in his new place of residence. And the most obvious type ornaments that stand out when we compare books printed in both of these regions are various florin designs attributed to the celebrated 16th century type designer Robert Grandjean, of which Mollijns owns several sets. The identification of Robert Grandjean as the possible author of these designs used by Mollijns also allows us to widen the possible network within which Mollijns operated as a printer, what were the influences of his time. And Grandjean originally hailed from Paris. Also, he worked in Lyon and Rome, and most importantly, for our context, in Antwerp, from about 1564 to about 1570, where he produced several types and type ornaments for Christophe Plantin and other Antwerp-based printers. Since Grandjean was active in Antwerp before Mollijns began work as a printer, it could be doubted whether they ever interacted personally during this time. Instead, it could be possible that Mollijns familiarized himself with Grandjean's ornaments while working for Plantin, and later would purchase some sets of his own. So far, I have been able to identify 4 different sets of Grandjean's type ornaments, which were owned by Mollijns. So this is the first one, a 2-piece combinable type ornament, which, according to Hendrik Vervliet, first appeared in Antwerp in 1565 at the office of Christophe Plantin. So that's the first one. The second is a 12-piece set, which the first known appearance again is attributed by Vervliet to Plantin's office in 1567. Here you can perhaps see well, at least that's good. Yeah, the Indexiva specimen characterum Christopher Plantini, which shows on the title page a design combined from these sets. The third one is a 6-piece set sold by Grandjean to Plantin in 1566, together with the previous 12-piece set. And again, this is an ornament that has been also widely used by Christophe Plantin, and you can also see it here on the wall, as it turns out. And the fourth one is a 7-piece set, created some years later than the others, dated with 1571, and with a first appearance in Paris. But it is also known to be used by several printers in Antwerp. And here maybe you will able to see an example from Mollijns in 1579. It's coming, yeah. So even though these ornaments later became widespread in printing houses all over Europe, these ornaments used by Mollijns have an origin that is strongly connected to the city of Antwerp and to Plantin's press. As Vervliet points out, they are cut in Antwerp. They first appear in Antwerp, mostly at the Plantin press. So there's this very strong connection. And Mollijns uses the Grandjean type ornaments throughout his entire career, both in Antwerp and later on in Riga, from the 1570s to 1625, when his last book was printed. And they are truly a staple in his book ornamentation. Next slide. Oh, well, that's a bit better. Yeah, here are some examples of these books from books that are printed both in Antwerp and Riga. This first example is a print from 1579 in Antwerp with with type ornaments from the 2-piece set framing a large arabesque ornament, which was also owned by Mollijns' father, Jan Mollijns I. And it is established that Mollijns took over his father's print shop along with the entire inventory, and in his Antwerp works often uses woodcuts and initials that were also frequently used by his father. However, so far it seems that very little of Jan Mollijns' inventory made it over to Riga together with his son, with one notable exception, which I will tell you about at the end of this talk. The next slide. Yeah, another one very similar to the previous, this time with a combination from pieces of the 6-piece set. Using the type ornament to frame other design elements was often a very popular design tool for Mollijns. And in the next slide, here, these ornaments are used to form a border around the title page. Also a very typical design, not only for Mollijns, but for printers during the 16th century in general. In the next one, what's coming is one of the very first books printed in Riga by Mollijns in 1589. Here, the Grandjean type ornaments are used on the title page, both to form a border around it and also combined to form various vignettes. In doing this, pieces from several sets were often combined, not just using one. In this particular case, manicules are also used on the title page to add some decorations. And this is a technique that was also sometimes used by Jan Mollijns I, using manicles or the pointing hands, not just to draw actual attention to something important on the page, but to use it just as a decorative element. And in the next slide, a later example from 1614 where again pieces from several sets are used to combine various designs, and you can see how over time this still remains a very popular technique for Mollijns. And in the next slide, oh, that's good. This is one of my favorite examples of the use of the Grand John ornaments. This is a print from 1591. This is also one of the oldest printed images of the Riga cityscape. And here it is framed by the Grand John combinable type ornaments. And I think it's a great example of Antwerp meeting Riga in a way, in the sense that these ornaments Mollijns had already favored in his native city are now combined with the needs of his new city of residence to print these images of the city he now represents, but the traces of Antwerp are still also visibly there. Now in the next slide, well, at first, Mollijns seems to have used these type ornaments to mainly frame title pages or to make smaller tail pieces. Over time, the designs he creates or his compositors create grew bigger and bolder. For example, this one again combined using pieces from several sets. And in the next one, this is one that takes up almost the entire width of a page, so very creative in designing these decorations. Moving on to the next element, it is this arabesque that travels with Mollijns from Antwerp to Riga. Here are some examples from 1581 on the left, printed in Antwerp, and one from 1596 printed in Riga. This is also a very popular ornament for Mollijns, seen on title pages as tailpieces in several prints. Vervliet again says this design was probably cut in Germany, but we don't know how this came into Mollijns' possession in Antwerp. But this is truly something that can tell us that this is a print by Mollijns and is a very recognizable design, which he uses often. As a caveat, of course, when we see these decorations being used over a great length of time, it raises the question whether the wood block from which these impressions were made could have really survived over such a long period of time through repeated use. Wouldn't it get worn down? And most probably at some point casts were being made from these original wood blocks. So maybe it's not the original item that survives on, but more so the design, the aesthetic idea that gets passed on, in some cases even for 100 years. And for the next one, another task was to identify the potential provenance of woodcuts used by Mollijns in Riga that have either an Antwerp or more generally Western Europe provenance, but were not used by Mollijns in Antwerp. So these are design elements that Mollijns would have acquired for his Riga printing office through later connections with Western European printing houses or with merchants. For example, we know that he made purchases from the Officina Plantiniana at the Frankfurt fairs in the 1590s and most likely had other trade contacts and opportunities to purchase woodcuts or types online abroad. The 16th century form of online, the Frankfurt Fair. So the first group of such designs that appear in Mollijns' works consistently from the 1590s onwards are two variations of these human-like faces flanked by either lions or eagles. The Torah database shows us that identical vignettes were simultaneously used in the Low Countries, also in Germany and France and elsewhere. This is again proof that Mollijns maintained contact and trade with the West after arriving in Riga. These vignettes appear in Mollijns' works with great frequency, as you can see in the next slide. Yeah. These were again being used on title pages, in tailpieces, and often both variations would often be used together. If one appeared on the title page, the other would then be printed as a tailpiece at the end of the book or in between chapters. And the next one. This is an interesting element that pops up in Mollijns' inventory in Riga. Again, Hendrik Vervliet says that this is an ornament originally cut for the French printer Jean Tournai I in the 1550s. And it has also been used by Plantin and other printers in Antwerp, but so far I have found no evidence that Mollijns would have used this in Antwerp. It does, however, consistently show up in his works in Riga. And well, it is not known how Mollijns acquired this ornament. It again possibly points to some trade connections in the West, his arrival in Riga. And the next one, the of Western European influence on the early Riga book trade are these initials inspired by Hans Holbein the Younger's Danse Macabre, which occur in Mollijns' works from the late 1590s. However, they do not seem to be used frequently. And in the next slide, if we compare them to the original images cut after Holbein's artwork, we see that the initials owned by Mollijns are not a direct copy, but a close variation. The composition of each image is similar, the number of figures and the signs depicted, but very small details are different. And this, of course, raises the question of who cut the initials Mollijns used. So this is still something to do some research on. And in the next slide, for the last part of this talk, I would like to talk about the traces of Antwerp and Niclaes Mollijns in the Riga book trade after his death. So this is something that was quite unexpected and very interesting for me doing research for this exhibition. The many ways in which traces of Antwerp and Mollijns still show up in books produced in Riga years and even decades after his death. Mollijns passed away in early 1625, and since he had married his daughter to his close associate of many years, Peter van Meren, who helped run the everyday business of the printing office and also worked as a bookseller. It is believable that he wished for his business to remain in the hands of his family and trusted business partners, which is, of course, something we also see with Christophe Plantin, who had his daughters marry his very close business partners. But in the case of Mollijns, this was not to be. Just mere months after his own passing, his daughter and her husband both succumbed to a plague epidemic, so they both passed away as well. And the future of the Riga City Printer's Office was now an open-ended question. For years, many craftsmen had complained to the city council about Mollijns' monopoly on the trade, wishing to establish their own printing businesses, and one of them, Gerhard Schröder, finally got his chance. So upon marrying Mollijns' widow, he took over the printing office along with its entire inventory. Subsequently, the inventory of the press passed over to the next heirs of the Riga City Printer's Office, who came after him. And while over the years they replenished the inventory with their own purchases of type and ornaments, some of the designs originally purchased by Mollijns were still in use some years later. So here you can see the Granjon various type ornaments, all of the several sets still being very popular, both on the title pages and to form various ornaments. None, however, as dramatic as the ones Mollijns produced. The next one, also the Tournai's ornament still remains very popular and shows up even 100 years later after Mollijns is known to first use it. However, over time, you can really see the deterioration in the quality of the forms from which these impressions are printed. You can see some nail marks start to appear and really start to deform from use. And the next slide. You'll just have to believe. So the arabesque ornament is also something that pops up every now and then in the later Riga City printers' books, also 100 years later still. So, but also severely deteriorating over time. And further on, also the vignettes with the human-like masks and faces, still very popular on the title pages, on tail pieces, and so on. So the next one. Yes, this is the interesting part. By the 1700s, most of Mollijns' ornaments and initials have disappeared from books produced by the later Riga city printers. As you saw, the ornaments have really deteriorated over time, and they were probably no longer meant for any use, with the exception of this one woodcut, which might just be the most intriguing discovery regarding Niclaes Mollijns yet, which is the printer's device of Jan Mollijns I, which he used in the 1560s and the 1570s, show up printed into books produced in Riga as late as the 1700s. So the question is, essentially, what's going on here, and how does this come to be? This image of the mole, which you can see in Latvian scholarship, has always been believed to be the printer's device of the printer Georg Kneller, who was active in Riga from the 1680s to the early 1700s. So he's believed to be the first one to use a printer's device in Riga, and everyone thought that this is his printer's device. Now, when we come to Antwerp and we look at books printed by Jan Mollijns, something strange shows up. Turns out it's actually his printer's device. So this changes what we know about the usage of printer's devices in Riga. So this one that has been attributed to Kneller in the 17th, 18th century is in fact something that belonged originally to Jan Mollijns I. How this came to be, how this woodcut appeared in his books is only open for speculation at this point. My theory is that Niclaes Mollijns would have brought over a woodcut of his father's as sort of a memento from his hometown. He never printed with it, and he never took on a printer's device of his own, but it seems that he kept it just in his inventory, maybe as a memory. And then when he died and his inventory passed on to the next printers, they would just maybe find it somewhere in a corner one day and then start using it without realizing the original provenance of this image, which very clearly is a visual representation of the Mollijns' last name, so the mole. So this is something that changes what we know about Latvian printing history in a small detail, but a very important one. So for the conclusions, yeah, here's also a close-up coming. And the conclusions. So a comparison of books printed in Antwerp and Riga revealed to us, first of all, that while this thesis, which was brought forth by C.P. Berger in the 1920s, and had not really been seriously disputed, but when we place these books together for the first time, we really see the work and life of one person. We see the influences of Mollijns' experience in Antwerp, traces of the people he worked with, also his family. It's not just the similarities in name, which first made scholars guess at the connection of the first Riga printer with Antwerp. We see the upbringing, the experience, the cultural context of single life. Second, while it has even been stated in Latvian historiography that Mollijns' book production in Riga bears no traces of his Antwerp past, a comparison of these books and attempts to trace the provenance of ornaments used by Mollijns really shows that the reality is completely opposite. Books printed in Riga during Mollijns' time and even after his death are full of references to his time in Antwerp. Again, the people he worked with and famous figures in Western book trade and the art world, who he might have not met directly, but still influenced his work, the likes of Robert Grandjean, Hans Holbein the Younger, and others. It also reveals to us the Livonian book trade is deeply steeped in the traditions of the wider European book industry and the tradition. It reveals a very strong connection to Antwerp. Mollijns remains connected to the Western book trade during his lifetime, and still traces of his work carry on years and decades after his passing. It is curious that so shortly after his death, already in the 1700s, the Antwerp roots of Niclaes Mollijns seem to have been completely forgotten, with historians confidently attributing his origins to Germany. But I hope that this exhibition, which you will be able to see starting tomorrow, and this primary research can bring some connection back to the forefront, and inspire maybe also some future research, because there's still very much to do on the work and life of Niclaes Mollijns. So thank you.
Okay. Okay, can everybody hear me online as well? Please let us know if you cannot hear us. Okay, thank you very much, Beāte, for this enlightening talk on Niclaes Mollijns' excessive use of ornaments.
Yeah.
If there are any questions at this point, please feel free to ask them. And online, if you have a question, just post it in the chats, and then we will ask them to Beāte here in the room. So are there any questions? I see a question in the room. Okay, I will first repeat the question for the online audience. So the question is, why did Niclaes Mollijns move from the Northern Netherlands to Latvia? Or
yeah. This
Livonia.
is a very good question. Still something that is not answered 100%. There are, again, theories about this. So some of the Riga City councilmen are believed to have had some connections in Antwerp who might have personally known about Mollijns, so they decided to invite him when looking for a printer, because the Riga City Council was purposely looking to establish their own printing shop, so they must have been looking for some candidates. How exactly they chose Mollijns, still, that is something we don't know. And for the other question, if the technology was already there, probably not, because any books that were in Riga before Mollijns were ordered in Germany or in some other countries. So the council would place orders in foreign publishing houses. So probably nothing that was there on the spot.
Are there more questions? David van Impe has a question. So the question is that Niclaes Mollijns' daughter also has a Dutch name, which implies that the son-in-law of Niclaes Mollijns was a Dutchman. Did he move with him, the entire family, to Riga? That's the question that they were asking.
So you have greatly picked up on the topic of my next conference paper. So, thank you. Yes, this is another great revelation that has not been picked up on previous historiography in Latvia on Mollijns, that it's not just him who moves from Antwerp, but it's other people active in the book trade who move from Antwerp. So Peter van Meeren, he is actually mentioned in the Frankfurt Fair documents here at the Plantin-Moretus archive, and he's the one doing business with the Officina Plantiniana on behalf of Mollijns in the 1590s, and there the document names him a son of Antwerp, I think, or something like that. So this is a document that we can hold on to where we can see that his son-in-law was also from Antwerp, which of course is very meaningful. His daughter and his apprentice Peter, they married in Riga. So I think Mollijns started a family actually in Riga, so this would be later on in life, yes. Yeah.
And this was also, so I did some research on a printer in Antwerp in the 17th century who moved to Vienna. And there were also 4 of them. So it was not just one printer moving. It was probably a group of people working together, knowing how to run a print shop, who moved as a company, not or as a kind of nuclear family. So it's always more than one person who moves. And we really should keep track of those as well. Thank you.
Definitely.
Okay, so next question is from our online audience, from Jeff Schaps. Were these ornaments used by Jan Mollijns in Antwerp his own, or did they come from the stock of Plantin? I'm not sure if he means Niclaes Mollijns or Jan Mollijns, but I'll leave it up to you to answer the question.
Probably Niclaes Mollijns, I think, but there is no evidence, at least so far, of. I haven't found anything that proves how he purchased these ornaments. So that's maybe a question to specialists from the Plantin Museum. Did Plantin give away his stock to his apprentices?
Well, I would say our archivist is at the moment out of office, but I think he is doing some research on the sales of typographical material, just as Joost de Puit, the curator of the typographical collection, is doing. So maybe
something could come from this.
Maybe you can give some more information, Joost?
Not yet, but it's something that we are looking at, how typographical material or ornaments were sold to others. Yes.
We do know that Christophe Plantin sold typographical material to Scotland, so it is a possibility that he did so the same way with Niclaes Mollijns.
So this is something we can still look out for.
Yes.
Yeah.
You should come and visit our reading room to do more research. Okay, is there any other question online? Is there any question left in the room? Yes, one more.
Anything you know about then the volume of production in Riga? Did he print, I don't know what the volume of production was, so how many books or pamphlets or?
So the volume of books printed in Riga is now esteemed to be around 200 titles, but he printed also a lot of ephemeral works, calendars, city ordinances, things like that, which would not have survived to present day. So it's something that's still only an estimation.
So the question now is 200 publications for the period that Niclaes was in Riga, is that a lot for a printer?
In the case of Mollijns, I would say it's probably not as much as he could have printed, because in the 1620s, his output was severely impacted by war in Livonia. So access to paper and the audience for purchasing books was very low. So he probably could have printed more if the conditions were more favorable for him.
Okay. I have another question online. Hidotes asks if your presentation or paper is going to be published somewhere.
Ideally. No specific plans yet, but ideally.
I think he is saying this because he's part of the Antwerp Bibliophile Society, and they have an open access journal, the Golden Compasses. And I think it would be an interesting topic to include in the journal. I think that's what he's alluding to. Anyway, I would like to thank you again very much for your interesting talk. Thank you for all the attendees online and physical in the room. Make sure to visit the exhibition if you can. It's open 1 month, starting from tomorrow night until the end of June. If you're not able to visit the exhibition, you can also just download the article on Niclaes Mollijns' Antwerp Years, offered by the the Association of Antwerp Bibliophiles. And I will wish you all a pleasant night and see you next time.